Chapter 310, Shadow Demon Next. Lowering his sword, Sunny stood in the silence of the empty room for a while. In the window, the distant axis of the crimson spire loomed, the light of dawn slowly painting it red. A subtle smile appeared on his face. "Awa, thank you, spell. What a nice birthday present." Summoning the endless spring, he greedily drank delicious cold water and then sat on the floor, crossing his legs and drawing a few deep breaths. "Let's take a look." Leaving his worries behind, Sunny dove into the soul sea and walked past the rows of motionless shadows. A long time ago, there had been just a handful of them. Now, hundreds of dark silhouettes watched silently as he approached the tenebrous sun of the shadow core. Among them were all kinds of horrors, creatures whose appearance alone would drive weaker men insane. The Mountain King was there. The Black Knight was there too. The terrifying spire messenger stood lifelessly on the tranquil surface of the water. And there were humans too. Harris was among them, and so was Harper. Sunny didn't pay them any attention. Standing beneath the shadow core, he sighed and summoned the runes. Name Sunless. True name lost from light. Rank Dreamer. Shadow Core Dormant. Shadow Fragments 977/1000. He was so close to accumulating the whole 1,000. If Sunny really wanted to, he could have abandoned caution and pushed to reach it before the inevitable journey to the Crimson Spire. However, he was wary of delving into anything unknown right before the fateful confrontation. He also felt that his time was better spent consolidating and perfecting everything that he had already learned and earned, not wasting it trying to acquire something new. Still, it was not an easy decision. With a sigh, he continued reading. Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Midnight Shard, Ordinary Rock, Prowling Thorn, Endless Spring, Blood Blossom, Dark Wing, Moonlight Shard, Old, Weaver's Mask. Echoes. Shadows. He tilted his head and read, an amused expression appearing on his face. Marble Saint. Marble. How fitting. Without wasting any more time, he summoned his shadow from the depths of the core. She appeared in a whirlwind of black flames, standing in front of him with her usual taciturn aloofness. However, Sunny couldn't help but gasp. The saint was indeed changed. She grew taller and was now even more oppressive. Her graceful stone-like armor, which had looked as though it was cut from granite before, was now entirely black and glossy, like obsidian or onyx. In fact, it was very much like the shattered onyx armor he had purchased with Kai's help. Her skin, on the contrary, became smooth and as white as alabaster. At least the small portion of it he could see through the visor of the helmet. Saint seemed much stronger, aware deadly. But that was not what made Sunny gasp. The thing that stunned him was what hid beneath the armor. Within the shadow that populated Saint's body, there used to be 2 ethereal dark embers. But now there were 3. Sunny stared at her for a while. Did she rise to a higher class? Finally, he calmed down and made the runes describing the shadow appear. A moment later, his hopes were proved true. Shadow Marble Saint. Shadow Rank Awakened. Shadow Class Demon. Demon, she is a shadow demon now. Shadow Attributes, Battle Master, Stalwart, Spark of Divinity. The next line had not been there before. Sunny held his breath. Shadow Abilities, Weapon Sage, Underworld Armament. He lingered for a moment, trying to suppress a triumphant smile. He had always known that Saint was not a typical nightmare creature, but to think that she would acquire an actual ability before even becoming a devil, and not just 1, but 2. Burning with anticipation, he read on. Weapon Sage Ability Description. Shadow Saint can effectively wield any weapon-type memory. Underworld Armament Ability Description. Shadow Saint's armor can accommodate a charm memory to inherit its enchantments. Sunny was silent for a bit, then turned his head and stared at the taciturn monster. No, not monster. Demon. A satisfied smile finally appeared on his face. Ah, how wonderful. Not only had his shadow grown tremendously stronger, but she now also had the ability to use any weapon he would provide for her, as well as reinforce her armor with all kinds of powerful enchantments. The possibilities this could provide her were truly endless. The potential combinations, the flexibility, all it took was to find proper memories. Sonny shook his head and grinned. Before, he had sometimes thought that Saint was really suited to command an army. But now he understood that he had been wrong. She was the army. A few hours later, the members of Neff's cohort gathered on the roof of the old hunting lodge, which still stood at the edge of the slum. Sation was also there, which made Sonny slightly uncomfortable. He didn't let it show on his face, however. The outer settlement was desolate and empty. There were no desperate, hungry youths around anymore. All of them were now either safely hidden behind the castle walls or dead. It was just the 7 of them. They came to see Kai off. The charming archer was standing near the edge of the roof, checking his equipment for the last time. He was wearing a new stylish armor and a leather jacket with fur on its collar. On his back, there was a quiver full of arrows and a backpack with water, food, and other supplies necessary for a long journey. Sonny didn't know about the rest, but his heart was heavy. As though reading his thoughts, Kai turned around and smiled. Really, guys, don't worry. I'll be fine. This is not my first time spending some quality time in the labyrinth. No one answered, knowing that the mission entrusted to Nightingale this time was especially dangerous, but also important. He had to leave the Dark City and explore the vastness of the Forgotten Shore in search of new humans sent here by the spell. Today was the day of the winter solstice, and that meant that out there in the real world, thousands upon thousands of sleepers were currently preparing to enter the pods and arrive in the dream realm. Sonny sighed. Just don't bring back anyone as irritating as you, all right. Kai chuckled. No promises. With that, he waved them goodbye. Well, wish me luck. A few moments later, he was gone, turning into a small dot in the sky. The remaining 6 people stared at it for a long time, their faces somber. Their future depended on what Kai would discover. Theirs and that of everyone else still clinging to life on the Forgotten Shore. A few days passed in tense anticipation. Sonny spent them doing the same things he had been doing before, training and preparing mentally for what was about to come. He had a lot of things to do. First came his technique, which was based on the flowing battle style that Nephi's had taught him, with elements of Shadow Saint's grounded style added to its adaptive foundation. His skill was growing sharper and sharper, slowly being elevated and solidified at the level that his current understanding of combat allowed. Sonny was not a novice anymore. He survived hundreds of deadly battles, and each left him stronger and more experienced than he had been before. But perfecting his technique was still not easy, because he had to make himself indomitable first, and then turn that firmness into flexibility. Now that Sonny finally had free time, he also used it to adapt his style to the new reality of his improved physical limits. Many things that had not been possible for him before the journey to the Hollow Mountains became possible now. The way he approached combat had to change, too. All of it took effort and a lot of thought to achieve. Second came the shadow dance. Sonny was still at the stage where he was slowly forming a practical set of moves to train in that elusive style. He felt as if he was now only one final step away from turning his vision of the shadow dance into reality. However, he seemed to be lacking some crucial ingredient. He needed one last push, one moment of inspiration to make that final step. Still, his exercises weren't useless. Until that moment of inspiration came, they helped condition his body and mind, make them adaptable and malleable like shadows. When the last revelation appeared, they would be able to receive it. After each intense training session, every muscle in his body ached, and a wave of mental fatigue washed over him. Third came the most important task. He had to turn his mind and soul into a fortress that would withstand the shock of the future. He had to achieve the type of clarity that would allow him to emerge victorious on the other end of it all. And for now, this task was turning out to be the most unattainable. It was hard to shape one's body and mind into a perfect tool, but it was so much harder to do the same with one's soul. However, this was exactly the barrier he had to overcome. Just like that, 6 days passed. On the 7th day after his departure, Kai finally returned. The charming young man seemed tired and ragged, his armor and clothes covered in dirt, dust, and dried blood. The quiver of arrows he had taken with him was now empty, and there were shallow cuts on the fabric of his jacket. Sunny's shadow had kept watching the skis above the bright castle all this time, so he was one of the first to know. By the time Sunny arrived at the small room that served as Nef's council chamber, Kai was already there, sitting by the fire and greedily drinking water from a crude clay cup. Effie was by his side, pushing a plate of food into his hands. Noticing him, Kai smiled weakly. "Hey, Sunny." Sunny hesitated for a bit, then approached the beautiful young man and patted him on the shoulder. "Hey, Kai, welcome back." Neither he nor Effie spoke after that, giving their friend an opportunity to catch his breath and waiting for the rest to come. One after another, Cassie, Castor, and Sation appeared in the room and greeted Kai. Nephi's was the last to enter. She glanced at everyone and then sat down near Kai. After hesitating for a few moments, she looked him in the eyes and asked, "How many?" Kai remained silent for a while, a solemn expression slowly appearing in his eyes. Finally, he turned away and sighed. One word escaped his lips. "And none." His voice echoed in the small room, making the faces of people gathered there darken. I scoured the labyrinth looking for any sign that a sleeper passed there recently, but there were none. There was no one alive and no bodies, not even a single fresh bone that I could find. The spell, it did not send anyone to this hell, not this year. And it won't the next one too, just as I thought. Sunny sighed. Sometimes it was nice to be mistaken. 15 years ago, the spell had sent 7 people to the Forgotten Shore. The next year, it had been twice as much, and then more and more. Eventually, hundreds of sleepers had been arriving in the Dark City after each winter solstice up until last year, when only 4 of them, Sunny, Nephi's, Cassie, and Castor, had come. 3 more had perished in the labyrinth, without ever reaching the cursed ruins. Because of that, inhabitants of the Bright Castle came up with a theory that the number of people sent to this region of the Dream Realm by the spell followed a certain cycle. If they had been right, then at least 14 sleepers would have appeared somewhere in the labyrinth a week ago. But Sunny never believed in that theory. In his mind, the 4 of them had never been meant to start a new cycle. He had always thought that, instead, they were meant to be the last chance the spell had given to the people of the Forgotten Shore. And now he knew that he had been right. With a sigh, Nephi slowly nodded and stared at the fire burning in the hearth for a bit. Everyone stood silently, waiting for her to make a decision. Finally, she said without looking at them, "Tell everyone to gather in the throne room. I will speak to them." Without wasting any time, Castor bowed slightly and left the room. Effie gave her a short look and then followed him. So did the rest. Sunny was the last one to leave, his heart beating like a drum. "It is beginning." 500 people stood silently in the magnificent great hall of the ancient castle. Beams of sunlight were falling through the tall windows, making the air appear bright and effervescent. There was no sign left of the terrible bloodshed that had happened in this hall just a few weeks ago. The bodies were dragged away, the blood washed off the marble floors. but the memory of it remained. On the steps leading to a beautiful throne of white marble sat a young woman with silver hair. Her ivory face was distant, and her clear gray eyes were calm and heavy. Hundreds of people were looking at her, waiting quietly for their lady to speak. Finally, changing Star sighed. A moment later, her voice resounded in the throne room, reaching far and wide. Dreamers of the forgotten shore. A week ago, I sent several scouts into the labyrinth to look for those young men and women who, like us, were sent to this cursed place. Among them was Nightingale, whom you all know. He spent 7 days searching for them, but he didn't find anyone, not even a single sign of their passing. This year, no one has come. A wave of stunned whispers ran through the crowd. Sunny glanced at the faces of people gathered in the great hall, noticing different expressions on them. Confusion, fear, shock. However, it wasn't as bad as he had expected. No one seemed to become consumed by utter despair. Instead, all of them turned to Nephi's, hope burning in their eyes. She was their hope. Until Changing Star was with them, they weren't going to give in to despair. Indifferent to hundreds of eyes observing her every move, Neph continued. Many of you understand what that means. To those who don't, I will explain. She lingered for a moment, throwing a glance at the walls of the ancient citadel. When she spoke, her voice seemed solemn. For many years, this castle served as a fortress for the humans sent to the forgotten shore. Some of you enjoyed the safety it offered, while others survived in the shadow of its walls. But none of us would have been here if not for the bright castle. It offered us protection against the dreadful beasts of the dark city. It offered us shelter. However, this shelter was never free. A dark expression appeared on her face. Some people lost their souls to preserve it, and many more lost their lives. Every year, hundreds of human lives were sacrificed to allow the bright castle to exist, and every year, hundreds more came to be thrown into its maw. Sunny silently scoffed. She was making it sound as though the castle was some creature that fed on human lives, not unlike the soul devourer, really. The meaning was subtle enough to not be obvious, but still affect the people gathered in the throne room. Observing them, he saw many sleepers shiver and frown. Insidious. Meanwhile, Nephi's continued. But no more. There won't be anyone coming to the Dark City this year, just like no one will come after that. Without new people, the losses we suffer will slowly accumulate until there is no one to man the walls, no one to fight off the nightmare creatures, no one to keep these halls safe, until there is no more shelter. This end. She made a pause, and then said calmly and with frightening finality, is inevitable. Her words crashed into the crowd of sleepers, causing a storm of emotions. Their eyes widened and their faces paled. The shock and fear they had felt grew tenfold. As if to hammer the last nail into the coffin of their worldview, Changing Star said, which means only one thing: we cannot remain in the bright castle anymore. Screams rose from the crowd, full of disbelief and terror. There were many things people were trying to say, but they all boiled down to 3. What do we do? How do we save ourselves? And save us, Changing Star. Sunny smiled. Nephi's remained silent for a while, letting the chorus of screams wash over her. And then, white flames ignited in her eyes, making everyone fall silent. Her voice resounded once more between the walls of the great hall, penetrating through the crowd like a sharp blade. But this not the end of us. A long time ago I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it. She suddenly rose, towering over the crowd like a shining, ruinous angel. Come with me, follow me, only I know how to save you. The radiance of her flames reflected in the eyes of hundreds of people, making it seem as though their faces shone with an inner light. Her words had submerged them into utter darkness, and then gave them a beacon to find a way out of it. That beacon burned with the most seductive of lights, the light of hope. And that hope was synonymous with her. Changing Star slowly descended from the steps, her words echoing from the marble walls of the throne room. "Follow me and I will lead you out of this hell. Follow me and I will show you the path back to your homes. But make no mistake." She stopped and remained silent for a few long moments. When she spoke again, her voice sounded calmer, colder, heavier. "The road ahead will be long and arduous. Not everyone will make it. The weak will die. The strong will die too. And those who remain won't be the same. But there is one thing I can promise you." Nephis entered the crowd and looked at the people surrounding her with absolute resolve burning in her beautiful eyes. "Follow me, and you will never be slaves." Sunny shivered, feeling as though she was speaking to him alone. Everyone in the great hall felt the same way, perhaps. Staring directly into their souls, Changing Star spoke. "Slaves to your fear, slaves to your fate, slaves to the nightmare spell. Come with me, and whether you live or die, you will do so as humans, not cowering beasts." She closed her eyes and exhaled, then looked down. "Finally," she said, the passion disappearing from her voice. "But I will not force anyone to follow me, ever. Whether you come with me or stay, it is your choice. There is no shame in staying. Those who do not wish to go may leave this hall right now." Sunny looked at the sleepers, trying to guess what their reaction would be. People were staring at each other, doubt and fear written on their faces. Not everyone was enthralled by Changing Star. Not everyone was brave and strong. Not everyone was ready to die fighting. But in the end, not a single one of them left. Nephis sighed and slowly turned her head west, as though trying to pierce the stone of the castle walls with her gaze. After a while, she said, "Good, I am glad, then it's decided." She turned to face them, furious white flames illuminating her pale face. "Then the day after tomorrow, we will leave the bright castle. The day after tomorrow, we march on the Crimson Spire." On the last day they would spend in the Dark City, Nephis led a small group of her most powerful warriors on one last hunt. The members of her cohort were all following behind her. Sunny, who stubbornly refused to accept his status as one of them, walked apart from the group, idly looking around and observing the ruins. Gemma and Sation were also with them, as well as 10 or so of the most experienced hunters, some of them formerly from the host, some formerly from the outer settlement. There was no difference between the two anymore. All of them were simply Changing Star's people now. As they were walking, Gemma approached Sunny and glanced at him with curiosity. After Tessai had fallen to Neff's blade, the tall man seemed to have found some measure of peace. Somewhere deep in his eyes, however, there always was a hint of sorrow. Sunny stared at him and raised an eyebrow. "What?" The hunter smiled slightly and asked in a friendly tone. "You're Sunless, right?" Sunny shrugged. "Yeah, that's me." Gemma silently measured him and then asked with interest. "I've heard that you lived for months alone in the city. Is that true?" "Ah, makes sense." The tall man was perhaps the most experienced hunter on the Forgotten Shore. He had survived countless battles on the streets of the Cursed City. It was natural for him to be curious about this matter. Sunny gave him a nod. "Sure, a little over 3 months, I guess." Gemma rubbed his chin, then asked bluntly, "How did you survive?" Sunny grinned. How had he managed that, indeed? Lots of hiding, lots of killing, a modicum of madness and a little bit of luck. Gemma stared at him for a bit, then chuckled. "Sound about right, I guess." After a while, he glanced forward at Changing Star and asked in a curious tone, "Do you know what we are going to hunt today?" Sunny looked at him with surprise. "She didn't tell you." The tall man hesitated, then shook his head. "She did, I'm just not sure that I believe it." Sunny smiled and looked away. "Ah, let me guess. Your first thought was that she had lost her mind. What can I say? Get used to that feeling." After a few moments of silence, Gemma sighed. But how can we kill it? Poor guy. Sonny glanced at him, lingered for a bit, and then said, "If my guess is correct, you know more about it than I do." And just like that, their conversation ended. By the middle of the day, they reached the eastern edges of the city and climbed the imposing monolith of the Great Wall. Standing on top of it, they saw the colossal crater and the headless statue that stood not too far away, its one remaining hand thrust toward the skis. Their prey was hiding in a vast underground chamber beneath that statue. Today, they were going to hunt the Lord of the Dead. At the base of the statue, the second arm of the priestess lay in the mud. Thousands of years ago, it had broken off and fallen, crashing through the dome of the underground chamber. Now, there was a chasm in the ground that led into the lair of the Lord of the Dead. Many months ago, Sonny and the rest had used that breach to escape from the catacombs. Now, they were going to use it to descend into that darkness instead. The ghastly master of the catacombs waited for them below. Sonny wasn't really surprised that Nephis had chosen to return to this place. After all, the mountainous abomination was most likely guarding the last of the 7 shard memories. However, he was really curious about how exactly she was planning to kill it. Once everyone gathered around the hole in the mud, Changing Star glanced at him and said, "Sonny, can your shadow take a look at the burial chamber?" With a shrug, he sent the shadow into the breach. It slid on the mud and entered the dark hole, then hid in the palm of the giant stone hand and cautiously looked down. The mountain of human bones was still there, in the middle of the vast circular chamber. However, it looked very different from how it had been before. Countless green vines were growing from the mass of bones, some of them comparatively thin, others as thick as a human body. They weren't growing just between the ancient remains. The vines were bursting through the bones, too, almost as if feeding on them. The Lord of the Dead seemed weaker, more brittle, as though it was sick, sapped of its strength and infected by a terrible parasite. Sonny commanded his shadow to look closer, and finally noticed the thing that he had expected to see. A small wooden box lay on the floor of the underground chamber, open and empty. The exact same box Nephis had mysteriously entrusted to Castor as soon as they were back in the Dark City. From the words of the outer settlement hunter, that box had appeared on his pillow with a small note. That note had been written by Changing Star's spy Sation, and the contents of the box had been created for her by Kaido, who was now dead. Kaido had been the leader of the artisans. Her aspect ability allowed her to control and alter plants. This bone-eating vine, as it turned out, was her last creation and final masterpiece. Turning to Nephis, Sonny hesitated for a moment and then spoke, his words causing a subtle reaction in Gemma. "The tyrant is heavily infected by Kaido's vine. It seems to be considerably weakened." Changing Star nodded and remained silent for a few moments. Then she said, "Once we enter the chamber, the Lord of the Dead will attack us. Now that its power is reduced, and with the help of the Dawn Shard, we should be able to survive the onslaught. We should also be able to wound and eventually kill it." Looking at the faces of everyone gathered in the shadow of the headless statue, she nodded and headed toward the breach. "Let's go." Soon, Sonny was trying to survive the fury of the Lord of the Dead once again. But this time, it was not as hard as it had been before. He had become stronger, and the horrible creature had become weaker. His memories were augmented by the Crown of Dawn, and Saint was now a demon. There were also more humans resisting the tyrant today. That was not to say that the battle wasn't harrowing and perilous. In fact, it was utterly lethal. The humans fighting the monumental nightmare creature were surrounding it, dodging the long limbs of the tyrant, and trying to attack it when an opportunity presented itself. Kai was zipping in the air, providing support and bringing the wounded away from the fight. They were only alive because the attacks of the Lord of the Dead were now slower and less devastating than before. With some preparation, both Effie and Saint could withstand one or two with the help of their shields. Castor was able to deliver several cuts to it with his ghostly blade, while Sation had broken one limb completely with her graceful war hammer. Each strike of the sunlight shard seemed to bring immense pain to the Lord of the Dead. But nothing hurt it more, of course, than the incandescent blade of Changing Star. Together, they dealt more and more damage to the terrible creature, despite the fact that many of them were now either severely wounded or dead. The tyrant was being consumed from within by the green vines, and broken from the outside by their weapons. And then, after a long and arduous battle, a huge layer of bones fell from the body of the Lord of the Dead, revealing its inner core. That core, which was made of human skulls and coagulated blood, was absolutely terrifying, malignant, and abhorrent. In its depth, a shape of a fat white maggot could be seen, curled into a ball. At that moment, Effie suddenly stepped forward, twisted her body, and threw the dusk shard as a discus with a deafening cry. The shield that was said to contain the weight of the heavens streaked through the air with terrible speed and hit the inner core of the tyrant, crushing through it like a wrecking ball. It cut the maggot in half and exited the body of the Lord of the Dead from the other side in a torrent of broken bones. Then it fell to the ground, shattering the stone floor of the chamber and sending a net of cracks running through it from the point of impact. The mountain of bones froze, then shuddered. And then it crumbled. Everyone stared at Effie, shocked hope burning in their eyes. On her face, there was a dark, mournful expression. Belatedly, Sunny remembered that the members of the original cohort that the boisterous huntress had belonged to all perished here, killed either by the undead army or the Lord of the Dead itself. A few moments later, Effie sighed and turned her face away, hiding it from everyone. Then she raised a hand and made it into a fist. That was her letting them know that she had received a memory from the kill. A shard memory. The last one there was. After everything was done and Nephis used her flames to heal those who survived, they returned to the city through the catacombs. Perhaps she wished to eviscerate the army of undead monsters that were now left without the tyrant to bring them back to life. But in the end, they were met with nothing but silence. The horde of ferocious skeletons that had once almost cost Sunny and the rest of the cohort their lives was no more. The dark tunnels stretching beneath the ruins were littered with piles of bones, which were slowly turning into dust. It seemed as though the moment the Lord of the Dead had been destroyed, its servants had perished too. After a while, the group of humans emerged from the collapsed tower of the lighthouse and continued on its way back to the bright castle. They were going to spend their last night there before leaving the dark city behind. In a small room in the depths of the ancient citadel, 7 people gathered around a table. They were Sunny, Nephis, Cassie, Castor, Effie, Kai, and Sation. Beyond the walls of the castle, the absolute darkness of the night had devoured the world. Nightmare creatures were prowling the cursed ruins, and somewhere far away, black waves were crashing against the indomitable granite surface of the city wall. Inside, the cold light of a memory lantern illuminated their faces. Strangely, everyone was silent, as though not sure what to say. Finally, Sunny broke the silence by yawning loudly. "Shall we get on with this? Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and some of us need their beauty sleep." He threw a sideways glance at Kai, thought for a bit, and then added, "Actually, every day after today is going to be a long one, so let's just do it." Nephi stared at him for a few moments, then echoed his words. "I do it." With that, they summoned their memories. An austere takai and a ghostly stiletto appeared in Sunny's hands. A graceful war hammer with a narrow beak appeared in Sation's. Effie summoned her beautiful bronze spear and a heavy round shield. Finally, a simple band of metal decorated with a single gem weaved itself from light and rested gently on Changing Star's head. They were the shard memories. Dawn, zenith, dusk, midnight, sunlight, moonlight, and starlight. The last memory was a short, flowing white cloak that draped itself around Effie's shoulders. This was the shard she had received after slaying the Lord of the Dead. For a few moments no one moved. Then Effie said, "So, what now?" Nephi's tilted her head a little, then frowned. Finally, after some time passed, she said, "Come closer." When they did, something unexpected happened. Sonny felt the hilts of his weapons suddenly growing hotter, and soon, both Midnight and Moonlight Shard began emanating a ghostly, ethereal light. The same was happening to the other shards. 7 beams of light shot toward the center of the room and collided. Then, they fused with each other, and soon, 7 objects weaved themselves from that light and hovered in the air. They were keys forged out of lustrous metal, with 7 shining stars engraved on their surface. It was the manifestation of the terrible oath that the 7 heroes had given all those thousands of years ago. The keys that were used to seal the curse of the all-consuming darkness underground. Suddenly, the 7 keys turned into streams of light and shot toward each of the 7 people gathered in the room. One beam hit Sonny in the chest and disappeared, absorbed into his core. The voice of the spell resounded in his ears. "You have received an oath key." Sonny shivered. He didn't want anything to do with that morbid oath. But in the end, he had no other choice. Glancing at the rest of the people gathered in the room, Changing Star lingered for a moment, and then said, "We're ready." In the dim light of dawn, the gates of the castle opened for the last time. A long procession of humans walked through them, leaving the ancient citadel that had sheltered them for so long. They walked under the swinging skulls, not paying them any attention. In the aftermath of all the strife, no one had bothered to remove the ghastly things from their chains. It was not like anyone could have forgotten the hundreds of lives lost in the struggle, and thousands of deaths before that, even if the skulls were removed. 500 people descended the hill and entered the dark city. A few nightmare creatures tried to attack them, and were eviscerated before managing to do any harm. These 500 humans were not a defenseless crowd. They were a battle-hardened army, one comprised of exceptionally powerful sleepers, the most powerful sleepers to ever be born from the human race, perhaps. They moved through the ruins, cutting down anything that dared to block their path. Soon, the sleepers approached the western boundary of the dark city and scaled the ancient wall. There they stopped and turned, staring at the silhouette of the bright castle in solemn silence. By then, pillars of black smoke were billowing from each of its windows. Soon, the whole castle was enveloped by furious flames, which slowly devoured the white stone of its walls. The magnificent marble cracked and melted, destroyed by the terrible heat. The smaller towers swayed and moved, and then fell into the terrible crucible. The fire was slowly destroying the bright castle, turning it into a molten ruin. In a sense, this was fitting. After all, everything else in the dark city had been ruined a long, long time ago. Surprisingly, this act of destruction was not Changing Star's idea. She wasn't the one who ordered to burn the bright castle behind them, like a final gesture to hammer it into everyone's souls that there was no way back anymore. Sonny would have expected something like that from Nephi's. But no, it was the decision of the people themselves. They wanted to destroy the ancient citadel because they hated it. They hated these ancient, blood-soaked stones only a little bit less than they needed them to survive. And now that they were leaving, they wanted to erase the bright castle from existence. Perhaps if it was gone, the memories of all the darkness that they had witnessed there and were the perpetrators of would disappear with it. After a while, the misshapen, twisted silhouette of the dying fortress was completely hidden by the fire and smoke. Slowly, the silent sleepers turned away from that sight and looked far away into the distance. They were looking west. That was where they were going. To lay siege to the Crimson Spire. One after another, the sleepers descended from the wall and left the dark city behind. In the cold light of dawn, a gargantuan crimson tower was rising from the labyrinth. From this distance, it looked like a bloodied sword that some primordial titan had thrust into the heavens. The crimson coral streamed from its walls like the blood of gods, spreading out from the base of the spire to devour all of the forgotten shore. The tower itself seemed to stand on an island, which was surrounded from all sides by black water. Even though the sun was already climbing up, this part of the cursed sea did not disappear. Instead, it lingered and moved endlessly, forming a giant whirlpool. Unclear shapes could be seen moving under the surface of the black water, drowning the hearts of humans who dared to approach the spire with dread. Sunny looked up at the endless expanse of the crimson tower and paled. Up close, it looked even more ominous, oppressive, and terrifying. He struggled to believe that this cyclopean structure had been built by human hands, let alone that it had been their salvation once, a long time ago. Now, the crimson spire looked nothing but twisted, eerie, and utterly evil. It emanated a sense of harrowing power that no human could ever hope to challenge. And yet, this was exactly what they were going to do. Turning away, he glanced at the camp of the Dreamer army. For the past week, the 500 of them had traversed the labyrinth to reach this place. Some had perished along the way, but not as many as he had expected. For that short journey, luck had been on their side. In these days, they had slaughtered countless nightmare creatures and somehow managed to avoid attracting the wrath of the dwellers of the deep. They had seen the headless statue of the Lord that stood halfway between the dark city and the crimson spire, and many other wondrous and terrible things. And now they had almost reached their goal. People were busy preparing for the battle. The dread they had felt at dawn, after looking at the crimson spire, which was now so close, turned into grim determination and resolve. Everyone was making final preparations. Some were checking their armor and weapons for the last time. Some were hurriedly building makeshift fortifications. Some were praying, begging the dead gods to save their lives. Truth be told, Sunny was the only person who appeared to be idle. Well, what did they expect? Nephi still had not told him what exactly his role in the battle was going to be. Not that he was obligated to listen, of course. With a sigh, he turned to the other members of the cohort, who were gathered around a fire, discussing the plan of the battle for the 100th time. Everyone seemed uncharacteristically somber today. One after another, they left to join in the preparations. Soon, Changing Star was the only one left. With a bit of reluctance, Sunny approached her and sat down, staring at the fire. After a while, he said, "This is very strange, don't you think?" She glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. Nephi's had changed a lot since the first time they met, but also remained exactly the same. She was still calm and confident, with ivory skin and beautiful silver hair. She was still strong and full of conviction. It's just that her eyes seemed a bit hollow these days. "What is?" Sunny shrugged. "Just all of it. If someone described this scene to me a year ago, I would have been really perplexed, and yet here we are." He lingered for a bit and then added, "We've come very far, the three of us." Both of them glanced at Cassie, who was busy explaining something to the artisan representatives. Her delicate hand rested on the hilt of the quiet dancer. After a while, Nephi's nodded. "Yes, and now we just need to make one last step." Both of them remained silent for a bit, thinking about how this final step was going to be the hardest yet. Incomparably so. Then Sunny sighed. "So, what do you want me to do? From how you kept avoiding the subject for these past days, I'm guessing that it's not something trivial." Changing Star smiled, then looked at him with white sparks dancing in her eyes. "A really small thing, really." Then she turned to face the crimson spire, hesitated for a while, and then suddenly said, "Give me your hand." When Sunny did, Something traveled through her cool skin into his shadow core. He summoned the runes and looked at them, already knowing what he was going to see. And there it was, listed among his memories. Oath Key 7. Somehow she had gathered the remaining 6 keys from the rest, and now she was entrusting them to Sunny. Still looking at the Cyclopean Tower, Nephi said, "I want you to destroy the Dark Sea, or banish it at least." Sunny grinned. A really small thing indeed. Very soon, the sun rose higher, and the dark whirlpool surrounding the Crimson Spire became a little smaller. Several bridges of red coral rose from its depths, connecting the island to the rest of the forgotten shore. And out there on the island, countless silhouettes suddenly began to move, crawling out of the crimson mounds. They were the nightmare creatures guarding the cursed tower. All kinds of horrors were among them. There were members of the Carapace Legion, scavengers, centurions, and demons. There were colonies of carnivorous worms, giant centipedes that secreted corrosive oil, and eerie vines that crawled on the ground like snakes. There were creatures that looked like black masses of rotten bones, and creatures that looked like humanoids made of rock, with terrible maws full of jagged fangs. There were swarms of translucent insects that devoured everything in their path and massive spiders clad in iron armor. There were beasts that could shoot deadly bone spears from their bodies and beasts that could turn their prey to stone with their gaze. There were corpses with red flowers growing from the holes in their flesh and giant abominations that resembled praying mantises, if those were made of glass and blood-red clay. And many more that Sunny had never seen, fought, or could describe. All of them moved together in strange harmony, devoid of the usual territorial aggression that forced the nightmare creatures of different tribes to fight each other. They were subjugated by the Crimson Terror and now served to guard the spire. Like a terrible wave, the horde of monsters rolled over the bridges of crimson coral and flowed toward the human army. From his position at the back of it, Sunny could clearly see the bodies of those standing in the front line tremble and take an involuntary step back. Someone even dropped their weapon. A moment later, Effie's loud voice rolled over the rows of sleepers. "Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself." Strangely, her irritated shout calmed down the fear in their hearts. A moment later, however, it was drowned in the cacophony of the approaching horde. The battle for the Crimson Spire had begun. On the outskirts of the Crimson Spire, there were no more passages and tunnels in the coral. It was just a solid red mass, an unbroken surface of the strange living substance that had devoured the forgotten shore thousands of years ago. Currently, Effie was standing on that surface. Several hundred people were standing beside her, staring at the approaching wave of nightmare creatures with horror and shock. All of them knew what was going to happen once they reached the spire, but even then, the sight of it was terrifying. She was at the center of the front row of these frightened people, supposedly in command of them. With her tall stature and lean, powerful figure, Effie stood out among the rest of the sleepers. Her archaic armor glistened in the light of the rising sun, and on her shoulders there was a flowing white cloak weaved from starlight. She held Zenith in one hand and Dusk in the other. Effie seemed like a bastion of strength and resolve in the sea of fear, a mythical hero that had stepped into the mortal realm from an ancient legend. But really, she was scared shitless. Looking at the rolling horde of abominable horrors with a grim expression, the huntress lowered her head a little and summoned the helm of her armor, which was crowned with a tall crest of blue horsehair, and thought, "Fuck me sideways, fuck, fuck, fuck." All around her, people were trembling. Some fool dropped his weapon and took a few steps back, as if considering running away. Even though she was currently seriously thinking of doing the same, Effie snarled and bellowed, "Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself." What was the point of running anyway? There was nowhere to run. If they were going to die, they might as well die like humans. Just like Princess had said, she was somewhat full of shit but also never wrong. "Get ready, bastards." Gripping her spear, Effie cast a sideways glance at the two men standing beside her. One of them was Castor, and the other one was Gemma. Who would have thought that one day she and the leader of Gunlog's hunters were going to fight side by side? Weirdly, the presence of her past enemy was now extremely reassuring. However, even on his face, there were hints of fear. The only person who could have stayed nonchalant in this situation was probably Doofus. That pale miscreant was either too crazy or too stupid, or both, to be scared of anything. But he was currently nowhere to be seen. Effie sort of missed the tiny menace. But Sunny was probably either hiding someplace dark or doing something too insane to be entrusted to anyone else. In any case, she wished him luck. She wished herself luck too. Looking at the approaching horde of monsters, Effie waited for a few seconds and then screamed. "First mark." Her shout was repeated by Sation, who commanded the second line and reached Knight somewhere in the third. The plan of the battle was really simple. The first line had to hold off the monsters, changing places with the second once they grew tired. Meanwhile, the third was in charge of eviscerating as many creatures as they could. But first, they had to withstand the initial charge. Nothing was more important than breaking the momentum of the attacking horde. Somewhere behind her, the enchanting voice of their resident idol gave the command to fire the siege engines. These monstrous machines were constructed by the artisans and were supposed to be able to pierce the armor of the most heavily protected nightmare creatures. As long as they were not fallen, of course. A strange and melodic sound reached her ears, and a fraction of a second later, 6 heavy metal spears, each at least 2 meters long, flew above their heads with incredible speed. They streaked through the air and collided with the front of the horde, sending bits of chitin and streams of blood to the ground. She saw one of them behead a giant crab-like creature, the other pierce right through a blood-red mantis and skewer several monsters behind it. But the wave of horrors did not slow down one bit. There was just so many of them. Feeling a shiver run through her body, Effie gritted her teeth, then shouted, "Second mark." Almost immediately, a rain of arrows fell on the monsters, wounding many and killing a few. There were many other projectiles mixed in with the arrows. Some sleepers used slings, crossbows, or more exotic projectile weapons. Some used their aspect abilities, which allowed them to create all sorts of sorcerous attacks, like flying blades made of wind, fire, and ice. Some could even create bombs filled with soul essence, which detonated in the midst of advancing horrors and ripped many apart. But still no reaction. The monsters only seemed to become more frenzied, the fury, madness, and bloodlust in their eyes flashing even brighter. The second rain of arrows fell, and shortly after, 6 more spears shot from makeshift ballistae crashed into the horde. By then, the nightmare creatures were already too close to the front line of humans to change anything. Making a step forward, Effie strained her muscles and threw the zenith shard into the approaching mass of abominations. The beautiful bronze spear shattered the steel carapace of an especially tall creature and pierced its heart. How could it not kill, empowered by the miraculous enchantment of the Crown of Dawn? All of their weapons and all of their armors were currently being fed raw power by Changing Star. All around the steel demon, numerous abominations fell, killed in a similar fashion by the memories thrown by the other sleepers. Summoning the spear back, Effie watched as the first row of nightmare creatures fell into a deep ditch that the artisans created just an hour earlier. Those moving behind them simply stepped on the bodies of their fellow abominations and continued moving forward. But finally, the speed of the horde was diminished, if only by a little. "Damn thigh! Brace!" That's all she had time to yell before the wave of monsters crashed into the line of humans. Then the world was consumed by nothing but madness, havoc, and death. Putting her weight behind the dusk shard, Effie leaned into the shield and gritted her teeth. A moment later, a monstrous blow landed on it, strong enough to crush stone into dust. But unlike Sunny's marvelous echo, she was not made out of stone. Instead, Effie was made out of something far more resilient. Arg! Pushing with all her strength, she felt the shockwave of the impact run through her entire body and then dissipate into the ground. Her bones groaned but held together. Despite the terrible pressure, she held too. A moment later, Effie growled and pushed even harder, throwing the carapace centurion that had crashed into her a couple of centimeters back. Simultaneously, her spear shot from behind the shield and pierced the black chitin, sinking deep into the flesh of the monster. She twisted it and severed the creature's spine, then slammed her shoulder into the dusk shard, sending the massive corpse flying off the bronze blade. Just in time. A second later, and the tall bastard would have skewered her with one of its scythes from above. But as soon as the centurion fell to the ground, another abomination was already taking its place, with a terrible salivating maw and furious eyes that burned with madness. Curse it all! All around Effie, the bodies of humans and nightmare creatures were entangled into an undulating, bleeding, roaring mess. Claws and steel weapons rose and fell, sending streams of blood, splinters of bone, and chunks of flesh to the ground. Screams of fear, pain, and fury mixed with the indescribable howling of the nightmare horde into a cacophonous litany of death. In this split second, she noticed one of her fellow hunters throwing the body of an iron spider that had jumped onto him back with a thunderous strike of his shield. A stone golem biting into someone's head with its terrible jagged fangs. A giant centipede wrapping its long, segmented body around a screaming human and sinking its 100 legs into his melting armor. Then she had no more time to stare. Hold, you misbegotten waifs. Taking a step forward, she dodged a harrowing slash of a 3-meter-tall mantis-like creature's scythe and brought the edge of her shield on the leg of the abominable thing. The thin limb practically exploded, sending the monster crashing down right on the blade of her spear, which flew upward and turned the head of the mantis into a red smudge. Before the creature even fell to the ground, Effie had already spun, receiving a rain of blows on her heavy shield. Her spear lashed out from behind it, piercing the body of the attacker through the heart. Blood flower. Effie held her breath and kicked the rotting primate in the chest, sending it flying back before too much of the damned pollen escaped the wound. The body of the blood flower host collided with another monster and exploded into bloody chunks from the force of the impact. You have slain. Noticing a shadow move to her right, Effie turned and thrust her spear forward, but at the last moment she pulled it back. The point of the bronze blade stopped just a few centimeters away from another human's face. For a fraction of the second, they stared at each other, Effie with confusion, the vaguely familiar young man with belated fear. Then, a massive shadow moved behind him, and the youth's head suddenly separated from his shoulders in a stream of blood, cut off cleanly with one slash of a metal demon's blade. Damn! Effie looked up at the terrible creature, but before she had time to react, something crashed into her from the side, sending a wave of pain through her body. With a grunt, she slid on the bloodied coral and twisted her torso to put dusk shard between herself and the attacker. A quick glance let Effie know that her armor was still intact, even if just barely. The point of impact was covered with seething acid, which was biting into the metal, trying to burn through it. Thanks to the enhancement of the Dawn Shard, however, the breastplate remained unscathed. She shifted her weight, preparing to deflect the next attack of the giant centipede. Before Effie could, though, something heavy landed on her back, trying to sink its teeth into her neck. She felt drops of blood streaming to her chest. A furious growl escaped from her mouth. Hurling the zenith shard into the maw of the charging centipede and practically severing the body of the creature down its length, she stretched her freed hand back, caught the monster that was trying to bite her head off, and threw it to the ground. The body of the abomination hit with enough force to make the coral crack. Just to make sure that the bastard was dead, she stomped on it with her foot, shattering the head of the damn thing into tiny pieces. But as soon as she did, 4 more were already around her, their sharp claws and fangs lusting to taste her blood. Bringing the dusk shard down on one of them, Effie grinned, then twisted and summoned her spear back. With blood streaming from her wounded neck, she dodged a powerful claw and laughed. "Bastards, are you trying to eat me? Ha ha ha, let's see who's gonna eat who, fools." All around her, the first line of the Dreamer army was slowly buckling under the pressure of the Nightmare horde. So many of them were already dead, and more were dying every second. Their bodies were torn to pieces and devoured, disappearing into the mass of monsters like morning dew. That sight was so harrowing and chilling that the mind simply refused to process it. And yet, the sleepers of the first line, those who possessed the most powerful combat aspects and the best memories, had achieved their goal. They stopped the devastating wave of abominations in its tracks and tied it down with their blades and their lives. The horde failed to roll over the human army, obliterating it completely without even slowing down. More than that, the massacre was not one-sided. For every human killed, several nightmare creatures were wounded, crushed, and cut to pieces. Arduously and at a great price, the first line was reforming itself, the survivors of the initial charge rallying around 3 champions. They were Effie, Gemma, and Castor. With each of them turning into a bastion in the sea of monsters and gathering fighters around them, the advance of the horde stalled. Whatever creatures managed to get past were met and eviscerated by the sleepers of the second line, led by Sation. And throughout all of that, the archers and the siege engines of the third line never stopped firing. "Stand your ground, wretches. If anyone runs, I'll kill you myself." Hearing Effie's voice, Kai flinched and forced himself to look away from the terrible visage of the horde of nightmarish abominations. Glancing down, he saw that his hand was shaking and clenched it into a fist. He had to calm himself, somehow, or his aim was going to suffer. That wouldn't do. But honestly, how was a person supposed to not be terrified when a literal sea of nightmare creatures, each stronger and deadlier than anything anyone should ever be forced to face, was approaching them so fast? Kai prided himself on overcoming things like stage fright and social anxiety, as well as getting through many unpalatable situations with grace and elegance, not to mention managing to survive in the Dark City for 3 long years without losing his humanity. But this was just too much. What would Sunny say? Thinking of his prickly but adorable friend, Kai couldn't help but smile a little. Probably something like, "Oh, a horde of nightmare creatures. Yeah, I've met one a few days ago. They all died when I sneezed, though." The strangest part was that he would be telling the truth. If Kai decided to dig deeper, he would discover something in the line of Sunny's sneeze, causing a massive avalanche that wiped all the monsters out. Or, more likely, that his sneeze had awakened some ancient, much more terrifying creature, which then proceeded to devour all the monsters before turning its gaze on Sunny himself. That was just how Sunny was. Unpredictable. Strangely, these thoughts succeeded in calming Kai down. He only regretted that the cute scoundrel wasn't close by to reassure him in person. Gazing at the approaching horde, he sighed and gripped his bow tighter. The coral was sloping down in the place where Changing Star had chosen to face the guardians of the spire. Because of that, the position of the third line was higher than the other 2, which would allow them to continue firing long after Effie and the rest had engaged the nightmare creatures in melee. In theory, all around him, those sleepers that had suitable memories or aspect abilities were preparing to shoot, waiting for his command. The surviving artisans and their assistants were busy loading the 6 powerful ballistae they had transported all the way from the Dark City and put together the last night. The sight of the mighty siege engines made Kai sigh wistfully. Maybe they were going to survive this battle, after all. First mark. As soon as Effie's shout reached his ears, he turned to the artisans and waved a hand, giving them the signal to fire. A second later, 6 heavy spears flashed through the air and crashed into the wall of monsters. Many of them were eviscerated, but these losses were like a drop of water in the sea of darkness. Kai gritted his teeth. Second mark. Now. As his melodic voice rolled over the third line of the Dreamer army, he drew his bow and took aim. Back in the real world, archery was Kai's favorite hobby. Not the practical skill of shooting a bow which was taught to many in school, but the ancient practice known as Kyudo, which was more of a meditative ritual than a real battle art. Its orderly nature, tranquil philosophy, and repetitive motions appealed to something deep inside him. The more stressed Kai was, the more he practiced. Who knew that one day he would be relying on his marksmanship to survive? Not that aiming at a literal horde of monsters was hard. He didn't have to worry about missing a shot with the blood arrow, at least. Letting go of the string, Kai watched as the black arrow streaked through the air and bit deep into the body of a tall carapace demon. Its bone tip pierced the metal armor of the terrible creature with ease. Not only was it of the ascended rank itself, it was also enhanced by Lady Nephis. Very few creatures could resist his attacks. Keep firing, kill as many as you can. The demon swayed, then fell to the ground. Kai felt the weakness that overtook him every time he summoned the morbid memory dissipate and called upon the blood arrow again. However, he didn't get to take his second shot before the wave of abominations crashed into the line of sleepers. For a second, Kai was stunned by the harrowing sight. The scale of the massacre that was happening below him was just too vast to comprehend. His heart was instantly constricted, full of worry for Effie and all the other people he knew. With a desperate grimace contorting his face, Kai aimed and shot again. And then he did so again, and again, and again. Everyone around him was doing everything in their power to kill as many nightmare creatures as they could. Arrows, magical projectiles, and heavy lances launched by the ballistae rained on the ghastly horde, reaping countless lives. But it was not enough, not nearly enough. Seeing so many people be torn to pieces and devoured while trying to protect him and the other archers, Kai couldn't help but wish that he could do more. If only I could fly up and get a better shot. If only I could get closer. But he couldn't. While others lost themselves in the battle completely, Kai had to keep a cool head. After all, he was responsible for the third line of the Dreamer army. The lives of all these young men and women depended on him. That was why he kept his eyes on the merciless gray sky. Just a few meters above them, almost invisible in the bright light of dawn, a vast net made out of sharp iron wire was drawn above the battlefield. The wire for this net was collected in the labyrinth, from those areas where iron spiders were known to nest, and fashioned into the aerial barrier by the artisans. It was meant to protect them from the terrifying creatures that could fall at any moment from the skies. After all, the Crimson Spire did not only have a terror and a horde of guardians. It also had its messengers: draw your bows, take aim, endure. Kai's words were meant to keep the morale of his troops more than they were meant to serve as actual instructions. To tell the truth, he did not have to do much, at least not yet. There were no such things as coordinated volleys when it came to archers. Everyone just had to send one arrow after another into the seething mass of nightmare creatures as fast as they could. He had to do the same, too. On the ground near him, several quivers full of arrows waited for their turn. Kai was shooting without a respite, alternating between using the blood arrow and these mundane ones. It took time for the ghastly memory to return to his hands, so he had to use something else in between. A good archer had to be able to fire 12 times in a minute. An excellent one, twice that. Gritting his teeth, Kai drew his bow, took aim, held his breath, and fired. Every movement had to be efficient, quick, and precise. As soon as one shot was done, another one immediately started. Draw, aim, release. Draw, aim, release. Repeat and repeat and repeat. In these moments, he had become less of a human and more of a methodical battle machine that ran on all cylinders without stopping even for a moment. He put an arrow in the eye of a terrible abomination that looked like a giant snake made of seaweed and rotting flesh. Another pierced the chest of a massive bestial primate and impaled him on the carapace of a mantis-like creature. The third bit into the neck of the mantis and greedily drank its tainted blood, causing the monster to stumble and fall. Kai felt like he was drowning. Back in the waking world, archers were always portrayed as nimble, graceful warriors, someone who excelled in agility and speed as opposed to brute strength and physical might. They were beautiful maidens, elegant youths, and cunning rogues. Maybe that was why he had been attracted to bowmanship to begin with. The reality, however, couldn't be further from the truth. It took a lot of strength to pull the string of a combat bow. The draw weight of a good bow was as much as 50 kilograms on average, 20 times the weight of a sword. And memory bows like his were much more monstrous. They were never meant for mundane humans, so pulling that string every few seconds burned through his stamina in mere minutes. Very soon, Kai's muscles screamed in pain, and his lungs seemed to be on fire. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep shooting no matter what. Keep at it, draw, aim, endure. How could he allow this insignificant pain, this unearned exhaustion to slow him down when out there, below? So many humans were dying in agony to keep the enemy away from the line of archers. Letting loose another arrow, Kai drew in a hoarse breath and glanced up, almost out of habit. However, this time, his gaze lingered on the indifferent gray skis. Then his eyes widened. At some point, 5 black dots appeared high above the battlefield, flying in an eerily perfect circle above it. A cold chill ran down Kai's back. Messengers. 5 fallen monsters were observing the massacre that was happening below them with vile indifference. Even though he could not see their harrowing shapes too well, Kai could somehow feel their gaze. Why aren't they attacking? As if to answer his question, a smaller dot appeared from the clouds and fell down through the circle created by the messengers. And then another, and another. Just a second later, countless nightmare creatures poured from the gray skis and dove down, swiftly approaching the ground. There were so many of them that their mass resembles a swirling black column of a colossal tornado. Kai trembled, his face paled. However, he did not allow fear to prevent him from fulfilling his duty. Skyward squads, aim high. At this point, about half of the sleepers in the third line were supposed to switch their attention and repel the aerial threat. However, engrossed in the battle that was happening below, most of them didn't hear or understand his words. Kai grimaced. And then his clear, enchanting voice rolled over the entire battlefield once again, this time easily piercing through the clangor and havoc of the terrible strife. Skyward squads, aim high. This was the voice he had used to sing the most difficult notes in front of hundreds of thousands of people. Only the dead could not hear it. Brought back to reality by his voice, the archers quickly aimed at the sky. Just in time. Kai let the blood arrow loose, then saw it fly upward and hit one of the winged abominations in the chest. The monster convulsed and dropped vertically down, hitting the sharp wires of the iron net with a sickening sound. A tremor ran through the entire net, and drops of black blood fell to the ground. Stretching his hand to grab a mundane arrow, Kai had a moment to take in the sight of the descending swarm. For a moment, his heart was squeezed by despair. There were so many of the flying nightmare creatures that it was impossible to count them all. Among the swarm of horrors, there were the giant locusts he had fought before, massive abominations with hungry maws and bat-like wings, repulsive birds with fleshy tentacles growing from beneath their pale feathers, and many more. Horrors he had never seen and could have never imagined. And above them, 5 black dots continued to circle in the sky. Putting the arrow on the string of his bow, Kai banished fear and doubt from his heart and drew it. Then, he aimed at the closest of the abominations and willed it to die. A moment later, his arrow hit the creature right in the eye. Most of the archers around him had already switched their targets. Only the siege engine crews, and those with abilities and memories unsuitable for firing upward, continued to pelt the nightmare horde with deadly projectiles. The quickest of the descending monsters were eviscerated, and soon a rain of corpses fell on the iron net. But a few lucky ones had avoided the arrows and dove down to devour the humans who stood on the ground. Kai held his breath when the first of them hit the iron wires at full speed. What if the net broke? But it did not, at least for now. The artisans had done their job well. Instead, the creature was instantly sliced apart, its body disintegrating into a rain of blood and strangely symmetrical chunks of flesh. The sight of it was morbidly fascinating. Thank gods. Reaching for another arrow, Kai found nothing but emptiness. Looking down in confusion, he saw that his quivers were empty. Have I used so many? Before he had time to process that thought, however, someone had already thrown 2 fresh quivers on the ground in front of him. Picking up an arrow with aching fingers, Kai inhaled through his teeth and raised his bow. Draw, aims, endure. Draw, aim, endure. Just as Knight shouted these words, Eiko tripped and fell. The bundle of arrows she was carrying in her arms scattered on the ground. Ouch! Picking herself up from the coral, she hurriedly gathered the arrows and dashed to the nearest archer, then placed them near his feet. In this battle, the role of people like her, those who were too weak to fight and did not possess a useful aspect, was simultaneously the most simple and the most chaotic. They were charged with supplying the sleepers participating in the battle with everything they needed, be it arrows, crossbow bolts, stones for their slings, or anything else. There were several teams of runners doing different things. Initially, she was supposed to help carry the wounded from the first and second lines to the makeshift hospital at the back of the formation. There, a few people with aspect abilities having to do with healing waited, ready to help. Her friend Stev was one of them. But as it turned out, there wasn't a lot of wounded in this battle. Most simply died on the spot. So she was left with nothing to do and ended up here, helping to supply the archers. She had just brought 2 quivers to Knight and was on her way. Wait, how crazy was that? Trying to catch her breath, Eiko glanced around and shivered. Crazy, this is crazy. The scene in front of her was just too bizarre to be true. Several hundred sleepers were besieged by a horde of nightmare creatures on the ground, with another falling on them from above. All that in front of an ugly, endless tower of crimson coral. Surely, she was dreaming. Of course you are. This is the dream realm, you dimwit. And yet, the weirdest thing of all was that she was stuck in all this craziness with none other than Night from Nightingale, the breathtakingly beautiful idol whose posters hung on the walls of most girls her age back home. Despite the fact that the two of them had known each other for more than a year, and were even, on friendly terms, this fact was the one that pushed the surrealism of the situation over the edge. This was exactly the kind of weird dream a teenage girl like her would have. Just as she thought about that, someone fell to the ground a few meters away from her. Turning her head to the sound of a muffled curse, Eiko saw Stev and another sleeper carrying a crude stretcher. On it was a young woman, covered in blood and pale as a ghost, her leather armor torn apart and on the verge of dissipating. A moment before, Stev's partner had tumbled down. It appeared as though he was wounded himself, albeit not too seriously. Running up to them, Eiko took over and helped the ample giant keep the stretcher even. Carrying that weight with her tiny body was not easy, but she gritted her teeth and persevered. Together, they hurried to the back of the formation. On the way, they had to run past the desperate archers and the exhausted crews of the siege engines, who were slowly but surely running out of the massive lances to hurl at the rampaging horde. From the look of it, things weren't going well for the Dreamer army. Down below, the first line was in the process of being completely eviscerated. 3 islands of resistance still persisted in the sea of monsters, but Aiko didn't know how much longer those poor people would be able to hold. The second line was now entangled with the nightmare creatures too. The initial plan had been for these 2 forces to switch positions to give the exhausted warriors time to rest, but now it was never going to happen. Up above, more and more corpses were falling on the invisible iron net. Despite that, the number of the flying abominations did not seem to diminish at all. The metal wires were groaning, having to carry more and more weight. Are we all going to die? Feeling cold dread spread through her body, Aiko trembled and involuntarily turned her head to the tallest point in the Dreamer army camp. There, on a protruding mound of crimson coral, she saw 3 figures. One was Saint Nephis herself, the other was her blind oracle, and the third. Wait, what is that guy doing there? The third person was none other than Sunny, the strange young man who had gotten her into this mess to begin with. After joining the Changing Stars faction, Aiko had quickly learned who the important people were and what positions they held in the Bright Ladies cohort. Everyone's role was clear and easy to understand. Except for Sunny. What role that pale youth played was entirely unclear. People seemed to consider him a member of Lady Nephis's cohort, but Sunny himself always insisted that he was not. He was thought to be a competent fighter, but actually, no one had really seen him fight. Most people just knew him for his tendency to keep to himself, ridiculous bragging, and carefree attitude. They simultaneously respected him for being Changing Stars scout and considered him mostly harmless. However, Aiko did not think that Sunny was harmless. She had seen him appear from the shadows and kill the guard who had been strangling her with one relaxed move, as though getting rid of an insect. In her mind, Sunny was very mysterious. He was a wild card. Seeing him with Lady Nephis now, she suddenly felt a tiny bit of hope. Maybe Changing Star had a plan. Maybe they were going to survive, after all. Aiko, move your short legs faster, will you? Frowning at Stev's remark, she looked at the ground and concentrated on not slowing her giant friend down. Soon, they reached the hospital and placed the stretcher on the makeshift table. Stev dashed to retrieve his tools. But it was too late. The young girl on the stretcher was already dead. Aiko remained motionless for a bit, staring at the ground. After a while, Stev cautiously touched her on the shoulder. Hey, are you okay, shorty? She wiped her face, then nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Gotta run, though. Those arrows aren't going to carry themselves. Stev lingered for a bit, then tried to smile. All right, stay safe. She smiled and nodded again. Yeah, you stay safe too. With that, Aiko turned around and ran out of the tent. Outside, the battle was only growing more ferocious. Sunny stood at the peak of a tall coral mound, observing the battle that raged below. There was a slight frown on his face, but his eyes were calm. The Dreamer army was besieged from 2 sides. One horde of abominations was slowly devouring its front line, while another had descended on them from above, stalled for now by the vast net of sharp iron wires. It was like a scene from a fever nightmare. Every second, humans were dying, torn apart by the claws and fangs of the harrowing horde of monsters. Their cries and screams fused with the roaring wails of the nightmare creatures into a deafening wave of dissonant noise. That wave washed over the crimson coral, sending a chill running down his spine. Turning away from the blood-soaked visage of the battlefield, Sunny glanced at Nephis. Changing Star was sitting on the ground. Her face was calm, and her eyes were closed. On her forehead, the gem of the dawn shard burned with furious white light, feeding hundreds upon hundreds of memories with raw power. She appeared to be in the depths of profound meditation, seemingly not affected by the horrible decimation that was happening below them at all. Cassie was standing beside her, looking at the ground. Her hand rested on the hilt of the quiet dancer. The other two echoes of the blind girl had been with the first line of the army during the initial charge. By now, they were already destroyed. Sonny wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. The time for conversations was over. Instead, he faced the Crimson Spire. His gaze lingered on it for a few moments, then slid back to the terrible sight of the slaughter. Straining his eyes, Sonny tried to distinguish the figures of Effie and Kai in the chaotic formation of the Dreamer army. "Don't die just yet, fools." Down below, surrounded by those warriors of the first line that still stubbornly clung to life, Effie had long forgotten about anything else but bloodshed and strife. The scope of the world had narrowed to the suffocating confines of the furious battle, consuming both the past and the future. There was only the present, and the present consisted of nothing but violence and death. And killing, of course. With a mad grin on her bloodied face, she faced one abomination after another, crushing, breaking, and tearing them apart. Her tall, lean body had turned into a lethal battle machine, moving with ferocious speed and devastating power, deadly precision and murderous will. Both Zenith and Dusk behaved like natural extensions of her limbs, alternating between attack and defense to reap one profane life after another. Her armor had been pierced several times, but she paid it no attention. It didn't matter. All that mattered was to kill as many nightmare creatures as possible, to obliterate as many of the hateful monsters as she could. Their corpses piled up, carpeting the crimson coral with an uninterrupted bleeding mass of broken flesh. After a while, Effie had to start watching her step carefully. Despite that, the number of abominations showed no sign of growing smaller. It was as though the horde was endless and boundless, but she wasn't scared. In fact, Effie was enjoying herself. Oh, this was so exhilarating. Dodging a serrated claw, she lunged forward and crushed the ribcage of an attacking monster with the rim of her shield, then used the remaining momentum to skewer another one on her spear. With no time to retrieve her weapon and turn, she used the shaft of Zenith Shard to deflect a blow from a mighty pincer of a carapace scavenger, and kicked the beast viciously, shattering the adamantine shell of its armor. Other sleepers were fighting around her, using the fearsome huntress as an anchor in the sea of death. They were still holding, still breathing. Two other islands of resistance had formed around Gemma and Castor, who were also in the throes of the battle trance. The proud legacy had turned into a whirlwind of ghostly steel, eviscerating any creature that dared to approach him. His movements were so fast that his enemy's blood could not even fall to the ground. As the result, Castor was constantly surrounded by a cloud of red mist. The experienced hunter fought with cunning and skill, sending one abomination after another into the embrace of death. Whatever wounds appeared on Gemma's body were soon gone, not even leaving a trace. Numerous fearsome creatures had been slain by his hand, unable to do the tall man any harm. And yet, humans were dying. One after another they fell, leaving less and less warriors to hold back the gluttonous horde. As Effie fought, a sudden thought entered her mind, sending a slight shiver running through her body. Heavy, that damn shield is so heavy. She was growing tired. Kai had lost count of the number of monsters he killed. Because of the constant cycle of losing blood and magically getting it back, he felt slightly lightheaded. Luckily, he had yet to miss a shot, maybe, and was able to continue firing. More and more corpses fell on the iron net, their blood flowing on the people below. It was as though they were now fighting in the rain, a red, fetid rain of blood. Blood, blood, blood. No matter where he looked, he saw nothing but blood. He was sick of it. Gritting his teeth, Kai drew his bow once again, aimed between two dead creatures above him, and sent an arrow flying. "You have slain and awakened." They were running out of arrows. The siege engines were running out of lances, too. And the damn messengers were still circling high above, not even trying to descend. Why aren't they attacking? Looking down, Kai tried to catch his breath and muttered, "Curses." Why was it so dark? He couldn't see where his quivers were. Something shifted in his mind, and then he blinked. Looking up again, Kai realized that the entire net was now covered with corpses. There were so many dead nightmare creatures that they formed a macabre carpet that veiled the battlefield from the sun. There wasn't a lot of daylight seeping through the net now, and it was growing darker and darker with each second. His eyes widened. Not because of the deep darkness, but because Kai suddenly heard the iron wires groaning under all that weight, almost as if strained too much and on the verge of tearing apart. The protective net was going to break soon. His face paled. Oh no! On the tall mound of crimson coral, Changing Star suddenly opened her eyes and looked at Sunny. It's time. Things were turning from dire to desperate for the Dreamer army. The first line was almost gone, and the second was now completely engulfed by the horde of nightmare creatures. Seishin was still standing her ground, but just barely. The archers under Kai's command were doing their best to eviscerate as many monsters as they could, but with their attention split between those on the ground and those diving at the iron net from above. The results weren't as devastating as they had been during the initial stage of the battle. They were running out of arrows and ammunition, too. The siege engines were slowly disintegrating under the pressure of so many consecutive shots. The people were tired. And the iron net itself looked as though it was going to break soon. It was covered with a carpet of dead nightmare creatures, submerging the battlefield into dim twilight. With every minute, that twilight was turning darker and darker. The human formation seemed to be balancing on the very edge of collapse. It was at that moment that Nephis, who had been calmly meditating through all of that, suddenly opened her eyes. In them, two blinding white flames were burning. Her pale face became illuminated by this radiance, like that of a merciless celestial creature. Turning to Sunny, she remained silent for a moment and then said, "It's time." He sighed. Indeed, it was time for the two of them to enter the fray and play their roles. As Neph stood up and summoned her sword, he flexed his shoulders and stretched his neck. The midnight shard, however, remained hidden in the depths of the shadow core. Sunny glanced at Cassie, hesitated for a few seconds, and then smiled. "Hey, Cass, I'll see you on the other side, I guess." She lingered for a bit, then nodded slowly and turned away. "Don't die." He sighed. "That's my cue, I guess." Together, he and Nephis walked over to the edge of the coral mound and jumped down, leaving the blind girl standing alone on its top. Softly landing on the ground, Sunny waved to Neph and said in an even tone, "I'll go first, good luck." With that, he turned in the direction of the battlefield and inhaled deeply. In front of him, the desperately fighting Dreamer army was intertwined with the nightmare horde in the darkness cast by the groaning net of iron wires. The whole battlefield had turned into a realm of blood, death, and shadows. The more corpses piled on the net, the deeper and darker the shadows became. This was Sunny's territory now. Stepping into the darkness, he suddenly became almost invisible. The shadows embraced him as one of their own, hiding his figure and movements. Veiled in their embrace, he steeled his will and dashed toward the battlefield. Moving forward, Sunny ran past the tent of the makeshift hospital, where a group of people was supposed to be desperately trying to save those lucky few who had managed to receive a non-lethal wound. Right now, however, the tent was partially toppled and engulfed in chaos. One of the flying nightmare creatures had somehow managed to squeeze under the net and was now wreaking havoc inside of it, its black body pierced by several arrows, but still full of deadly power. Sunny moved past it without looking back. Stepping through the deepest, darkest shadows, he ran past the line of siege engines and noticed the small figure of Aiko helping an exhausted artisan load one last spear into position. The steel lance was clearly too heavy for the delicate girl, but she was pushing it up with stubborn determination. Then he was between the rows of archers. These people were continuing to fire, desperately trying to find clear spots between the numerous corpses piled on top of the trembling iron net. He saw Kai looking around with a lost look on his face. Sunny wanted to stop and reassure his friend, but couldn't. Sliding between these people without being noticed, he left the third line and dashed toward the second. Here, his task of remaining unseen became much harder. The second line had lost almost all pretense of order, but remained unbroken. With the warriors under Effie's command still taking on the brunt of the horde and withstanding its pressure, Seishin had managed to prevent any abominations from reaching the archers. At least for now. Dodging the defending humans and the attacking monsters, Sunny entered the crucible of battle. He wasn't here to fight, however. His goal was still ahead. Moving unseen, he evaded several vicious skirmishes. Somewhere along the way, he noticed Seishin herself. The beautiful woman was fighting with darkly fascinating grace. The sunlight shard rose and fell, guided by her slender hand. The amount of power delivered by each strike, however, was nothing short of terrifying. Every time the warhammer struck, a nightmare creature was broken apart, with bits of chitin, bone, and streams of blood flying into the air. It was still not enough, though. After another blow, a menacing figure of a carapace scavenger suddenly grasped the memory in its powerful pincer and tore it away from Seishin's hand. In the next moment, a subtle change happened to the body of the graceful handmaiden. It seemed as though she grew taller, her limbs elongating, her spine twisting. Her smooth gray skin became like that of a shark, and her eyes rolled back, revealing a second pair of pupils, these ones vertical and surrounded by a sea of red. Seishin's jaw unhinged, revealing several rows of terrible fangs. Dashing forward, she easily broke the carapace of the nightmare creature with her bare fist. A fraction of a second later, her jaws closed on the joint of the pincer, piercing the chitin, and tore the entire limb apart. It was hard to tell who was the real monster between the two. Leaving that disturbing scene behind, Sunny moved into another layer of shadows and ran toward the first line. There, the mass of abominations and surviving humans was almost impenetrable, and yet he had to pierce it. Drawing in a deep breath, Sunny dove into the sea of nightmare creatures. Moving between the endless horde of monsters like a nimble dancer, he dodged and avoided their chaotically moving bodies, keeping to the shadows. If he was noticed, he was going to be torn apart in mere seconds. If he slowed down, he was going to be crushed and obliterated. Like a shadow, Sunny slid between them. A few times, he had to quickly dash beneath an especially tall abomination or jump over a smaller one. For a few seconds, he even ran on top of these horrible monsters, jumping from the shoulder of one to the carapace of another, and then back to the bloodied, slippery ground. On his way, he saw Effie. The huntress had either lost or dismissed her shield, and was now spinning her spear and using it to deliver both piercing and slashing attacks, drawing wide arcs in the air with its bronze blade. Her body was covered in blood, and her armor was broken and shattered. But on her face, there was a wide, joyful grin. Leaving it all behind, Sunny moved deeper into the horde of monsters. A few times he thought that he would be noticed, but in the end the shadows had kept him safe. And after a while, an eternity, maybe, he finally broke free of the endless mass of nightmare creatures. Now there was nothing in front of him but the wide expanse of the cursed black water, and the mass of the crimson spire stretching endlessly into the skies. Sonny froze for a moment, captivated by the all-encompassing expanse of the Cyclopean spire that towered above the entire world. Almost at the same moment, the darkness behind him was suddenly annihilated by a blinding explosion of light. The noise of the battle changed, somehow growing even more intense. The howling of the nightmare horde grew louder, but also became slightly muffled, almost anxious. Changing Star had finally joined the fight. A moment later, hundreds of human voices rose in a deafening battle cry, their spirit lifted, their crumbling resolve restored. With Nephi's arriving on the battlefield, the balance of the whole battle shifted. The nightmare creatures surged to destroy the radiant figure, only to be obliterated by it. They almost seemed to melt under the furious assault of the incandescent blade, turning into cinder and ash. Neph's arrival brought a moment of relief to the exhausted warriors of the Dreamer army. Instead of using it to catch their breaths and regroup, however, they chose to use this opportunity to launch into a ferocious attack, making the horde shudder and recoil. Sonny was not paying any attention to what was happening behind his back, though. His eyes were locked on the bridge of crimson coral that stretched across the vast whirlpool of black water, creating a path to the island on which the cursed spire stood. On it were countless abominations, each of them pushing, howling, fighting for their turn to taste soft human flesh. However, the harrowing mass of them wasn't endless anymore. He could actually see the tail of the nightmare horde, with the distant half of the bridge being almost empty. Not that it was going to make things easy for him. As soon as Sonny escaped from beneath the iron net, he became illuminated by the bright sunlight, with nowhere else to hide, completely exposed. The eyes of numerous monsters were already on him, bloodlust and hunger igniting in their depths. If he wanted to use the bridge, he was going to have to cut his way through the undulating mass of nightmare creatures. Saint. Answering his call, the marble demon appeared from the shadows, her ruby eyes burning with cold menace behind the visor of the onyx helmet. The taciturn knight stood silently on the shore of the rushing black water, gazing at the horde of monsters across its dark expanse. Sonny took a few steps back and glanced at the mass of abominations who were already lunging in his direction. Here goes nothing. Dashing forward, he crossed the distance to the saint and jumped. The shadow raised her shield, allowing him to step on it, and then pushed away with all her incredible strength. Simultaneously, Sonny launched himself off this unlikely springboard and shot into the air. The wind whistled in his ears. Soaring above the mass of black water and all the horrors that hid in its depths, he flew toward the crimson spire with terrible speed. The dark wing turned into a blur behind his back, making Sonny weightless and thus prolonging this state of flight. It was still not nearly enough to reach the island, however. In a few short seconds, he crossed almost half of the wide surface of the dark whirlpool. But then, his momentum slowed and soon, Sonny started to fall. Thanks to the transparent cloak, he didn't plunge straight down, instead gliding through the air, slowly approaching the seething black water. He was never going to make it. But then, he was never planning to. Twisting his body, Sonny hurled the prowling thorn at the crimson coral of the bridge. As soon as the heavy kunai bit into it, he forcefully pulled on the invisible string, changing the direction of his flight. A few seconds later, Sonny landed on the bridge in a roll and jumped to his feet. Behind him, the tail end of the nightmare horde was still oblivious to his presence. In front of him was a clear path to the crimson spire. Dismissing the dark wing and summoning Shadow Saint back into his core, Sonny ran forward without wasting even a moment to look back. Soon, the crimson spire eclipsed the whole sky. It seemed as though the world suddenly made a 90-degree turn, the ground itself becoming vertical instead of horizontal. Even craning his neck, Sonny couldn't see the top of the ominous tower anymore. It was as if the dream realm was like a box, and he had reached one of its walls, the edge of reality itself. Throwing all unnecessary thoughts out of his head, Sonny rushed toward the spire. His goal was almost in sight. 7 severed heads, guarding 7 locks. This was what Cassie had told them a year ago, at the start of this cursed journey. Somewhere at the base of the Crimson Spire, there was a place where one could insert 7 keys into 7 locks to seal the curse of the all-consuming darkness underground once more, thus restoring the oath of the ancient heroes. Shard memories had given Changing Stars cohort these keys, and now Sonny held all of them in his soul. He just had to find the locks. And very soon he did. Hidden behind a tall mound of crimson coral, a vast expanse of flat surface led all the way to the walls of the corrupted spire. On it, arranged in a wide semicircle, 7 giant heads stared away from Sonny. Despite the fact that they were facing the other way, he recognized them immediately. These were the stolen heads of the 7 colossal statues that stood across the desolate hell of the Forgotten Shore, ones that had been torn off their shoulders by the Crimson Terror thousands of years ago, and then brought here, to lay at the base of its citadel for all eternity. The Lord, the Priestess, the Knight, the Hunter, the Builder, the Slayer, and the Stranger. Their gazes were aimed at the gargantuan gates of the spire. And there, on those gates, the image of 7 shining stars was engraved into the ancient stone. Each star had a dark keyhole in its radiant center. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.